Hello, welcome to Serving on Nonprofit Boards, Tips for Young Lawyers. This program today is brought to you by the American Bar Association Young Lawyers Division and is part of the A Seat at the Table initiative. So the Young Lawyers Division is the ABA's home for the new attorney, giving members tools to navigate the early years of a career, opportunities to network, and resources to grow your skill sets. A Seat at the Table is a specific initiative of the Young Lawyers Division, which encourages young attorneys to get involved in their communities, educating them on what it takes to run for office, serve on local, state, and nonprofit boards and commissions, and to advocate on issues of importance both to young lawyers and the legal profession as a whole. This is Perry McLennan speaking. I am the director of the civic engagement team for the ABA YLD. The civic engagement team is in charge of the Seat at the Table initiative. I am a practicing attorney at Haynesworth Sinclair Boyd Law Firm in South Carolina. I practice employment law primarily, but do some general corporate work as well. I've have some experience serving on nonprofit boards and other advisory and interest groups. Hope to share a little bit about that with you today. Also joining me today is my friend Andy Jones, who's also a member of the civic engagement team. Andy, you want to introduce yourself really quickly?
Sure. Thanks, Perry. Good afternoon, everybody. Good to join you on the webinar today. I'm Andy Jones. I'm a business lawyer in Wilmington, North Carolina, with a group called the Forest Firm. And I'm also a member of the civic engagement team with Perry, so excited to be working with him on these initiatives to help young lawyers find a seat at the table. On the ABA, I'm also a representative, district representative for North Carolina, District 9. So excited to be with you all today.
Thank you, Andy. A couple of points before we get started. Andy and I are gonna go through, and we've got some thoughts to share with you today, some experiences, some advice. We are certainly, Andy and I are both young lawyers ourselves, so we're certainly not experts or anything like that on this topic. I'm sure there's many of you listening to this webinar that have your own experiences with this and may be able to provide some insight as well. You'll notice, as mentioned at the beginning, that there is a ability for attendees to ask questions during the presentation. And at the end, we will reserve some time to try and answer those questions as best we can. We did receive about 8 questions or so through the registration link, which was great, and we'll address those first, and then we will try to address any additional ones that come up. So with that, we will go ahead and get started. So the first topic is why you, as a young lawyer, should consider joining a nonprofit board. And I think this is an important place to start because time and time again, what I hear from young lawyers, as well as what I find to be true in my own practice, is that the demands are very high on young lawyers for their time, and you only have limited time and resources, and everybody has families and friends and things like that they want to enjoy outside of work, and joining a nonprofit board is certainly a time commitment. But we've outlined a few reasons that we can think of. That's certainly not an exhaustive list of why you should consider it. And I'll kick us off with the first one, which is legal experience. I think that just simply serving on a nonprofit board, not in the capacity as a lawyer advising the board, but in the capacity of a board member, can actually provide you with some legal experience that you would not otherwise have potentially in your law practice. So, just by way of example, one of the one of the things that board members are often tasked with doing as part of board service is reviewing and approving bylaws. And you may be a corporate lawyer and be intimately familiar with bylaws and never want to see bylaws again, or you may be more like me and do an employment law, and I don't see bylaws quite as often. So when I joined the nonprofit board that I serve on, reviewing those bylaws, getting familiar with them, understanding how the bylaws apply to the organization, and to the board as well, and how all that works was really valuable insight for me. And I really felt like, through that experience, I would potentially be comfortable, doing that type of work for a client, whether another nonprofit or, other organization. Um, there are other examples of that. I've had in my board service, I've had, liability and insurance type of issues arise. Whether it's personal injury or, disputes with third parties, that kind of thing. Um, there are always, staff and personnel and sort of employment law issues that you can be exposed to by serving on a nonprofit board. 501c3 applications, regulatory issues, all of that type of stuff. And you also may be placed in the position of working with outside counsel or hiring another lawyer on behalf of the board to advise the organization. So you can certainly gain some valuable legal experience, and I've found that certainly to be true. Um, Andy, do you want to talk a little bit about business experience?
Sure. I think for me, one of the real benefits of serving on a nonprofit board has been, as a young lawyer, getting involved in business operations and decision making a lot earlier than a lot of my peers who are not involved in nonprofits. I recognize that young lawyers come from a variety of different backgrounds, but generally, many young lawyers don't have experience in the private sector in any material way when they've come out of law school. And so jumping into a role on a board gets you directly involved with business decision making, looking at financial statements, strategic board decisions, management level decisions such as hiring, firing, coming up with strategic plans. I mean, a number of things that law firms as businesses, and if you're in the private sector, your clients who are businesses, deal with on a day-to-day basis. So being in the seat from a board level of a nonprofit of any size puts you in a position of having to see and hear the same type of concerns that if you're in the private practice of law, your clients are dealing with on a daily basis. It gives you a leg up because you can say, I have seen this issue myself. I've encountered this sort of decision myself. And even if you don't say that, it gives you the background to better understand where some of the questions your clients are tendering to you are coming from the business side. I can tell you from my own experience, I'm involved in several nonprofits, one of which is about a $40 million organization in southeastern North Carolina in the mental health and substance abuse crisis intervention space. almost 600 employees. I'm the chair of that board this year, and that's an experience of working with a diverse group of people on something that's pretty exciting with a whole lot of different business issues going on at the same time. But I know that if I wasn't on that board, I wouldn't have comparable experience at this stage in my career. So serving on a nonprofit board really gives you an opportunity to have some significant business experience you otherwise wouldn't have.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and there's a few great points there. I think just to add on, one thing that immediately pops to my mind is that for some of you that went straight from college to law school, and like I did, and perhaps for some of you who had liberal arts majors and that type of thing, learning how to read and analyze financial statements is huge. I mean, that, really understanding that type of thing can be very valuable to your clients and to your overall career development. And, I know Andy has been involved in, various leadership positions within his firm, and I've been in some leadership positions with my firm as well. And this gives you a potentially a platform to do that. And you may decide that you love having a seat at the table on business decisions so much that you may think, well, maybe the private practice of law is not what I want to do, but I want to shift my career into more of this business setting where I can do, more of this type of work. So I think it provides you a lot of opportunities there. Personal fulfillment outside of work, these are certainly not in order of importance. Personal, and it's probably a little bit different for everyone what your reasoning is to join a nonprofit board. I would say that kind of last one we just went over was sort of the primary one for me, but I have been sort of delighted at how much personal fulfillment outside of work that I have received. And this probably will rank, very high, if not the first on your list of why you're considering joining a nonprofit. Making a difference in the community, if you are community service minded, which I am finding that our generation of young lawyers is particularly service oriented. And this provides a wonderful opportunity to do that. I serve on the board of an organization that provides support for kinship care families for children who have been removed from the home for one reason or another. Either their parents are on drugs or in jail or cannot care for them, and someone, a grandmother, an uncle, a neighbor, someone has taken those children in, and as opposed to the children going into the state system. And the organization I serve on the nonprofit board for provides resources to those children and families, and it's a wonderful organization. I've gotten so much enjoyment out of it, and I think it's easy sometimes, depending on your law practice, to wonder what kind of real difference in the world you're making in your law practice. Particularly, I think if you're sort of in the corporate business realm, as both Andy and I are, and serving on a nonprofit board can certainly give you some of that sense of making a difference. And I've made great friends through my nonprofit board service, and it really has been a great break from the practice of law. I actually look forward to going to the board meetings every month. I look forward to the committees that I serve on that board and that work. It's a nice sort of break from the practice of law. So I've gotten a lot of fulfillment out of that. Andy, happy to have your thoughts on business development and anything I said as well.
Sure. Yeah. I want to build on what you said about personal fulfillment. As you mentioned, both of us are in the private practice of law, so we don't have the benefit of working and feeling like we are fighting for public causes in our day-to-day work. Many of you on the call may be in that position, but for me, as a private sector lawyer, this is where the real good work of making a difference in discrete areas in our communities happens. Every one of my board roles I've joined because I agree with the mission and the vision of the organization in solving a social ill in my community. And so that is, well, certainly I'm not diminishing the work we do for our business clients. Strong business climate is certainly incredibly important to support all of that. But the work of these nonprofits is incredibly rewarding. So let me encourage you in finding something that you care about to join. For business development, that's certainly not a motivation. Was not a motivation for me in getting involved in a nonprofit board. But I have to say, as lawyers, you all have experienced, I'm sure, folks they put you up on a bit of a pedestal. We've been to law school. People believe we know all the laws. People believe we have the analytical capacity to think about things strategically and critically in a way that's valuable. And I found that in serving on a board, folks will immediately look to you for guidance just because you're a lawyer. So that in turn, if you sort of rise to the occasion and do your homework and your due diligence and communicate rationally and analytically on issues before the board, that is naturally going to turn into business development opportunities. Folks that are members of boards of nonprofits are people that are involved in their communities, business owners or public figures or others who are interested in the topics that the nonprofit addresses. Those are potential clients. So if you're in the private practice of law and you're looking for a way to get out and get more visible and make your name known to people in the community, joining a nonprofit board is the way to do that. There's no question. Join the board, but join it actively. Ask good questions, get involved in committees, volunteer for leadership, and you will find yourself hobnobbing and building relationships with people that can certainly bring in business for you in your own private practice.
I think that's very well said. I don't really have anything to add to that. I think that's perfect, Andy. Thank you. And that, sort of all of those things that we talked about with respect to why you should consider joining a nonprofit if you have sort of made that decision that, yeah, this is something that I'm definitely interested in doing. I think the next logical question becomes, okay, well, how do I go about doing that? I want to serve, but I need to sort of find the right board to serve on. And I think the first thing to think about, and Andy mentioned being invested in the mission of the organizations that he serves on. I think that's critical. I mean, I think that is the number one thing about joining a nonprofit board, is that you've got to care about the mission of the organization and the work of the organization. If you don't, if you're not fully invested in that, you're not going to put your best foot forward on the board. You're not going to get much out of it. The business development and business experience and all of that kind of stuff is, not going to come along with it. And so to make it a really worthwhile experience, I think you have to care about the mission of the organization. And look, that's going to be something different for every person. Andy and I certainly can't tell you what you're passionate about, but certainly, you can research organizations within the community. You know, we all went to law school. We all have, research skills and can find, outlets through the internet to find those organizations. I'll tell you that the organization I joined on the board, it was not something that I was initially passionate about. I didn't know a whole lot about the organization. I went about it a little bit the other way with finding someone within my law firm who served on the organization and just learning about it through him. But I was fortunate that after I joined, um, I found that I became extraordinarily invested in the mission and the success of the organization. So you don't always have to start from that place. You can, if you think it's a good board and you think it does good work, you don't have, it doesn't have to be your life's passion. But I think you do have to care about the organization's mission in order to do that. So,
Perry, I'm going to build on that for a second. I think a lot of communities will have volunteer fairs or opportunities to connect with nonprofits through the chamber or otherwise, where nonprofit leaders are begging for bright lawyers and other professionals, particularly young lawyers, to come and join them and help bring energy and vision to the organization. So I would definitely encourage, if any of you are interested in finding a nonprofit and don't really have anything that you feel drawn to, go find a volunteer fair like that and stop at every table and ask questions about folks' mission. That's a great way to learn a little bit more about what's out there in your community. I also, to the sort of building on that point, where do colleagues and mentors serve? Ask folks you trust. I can remember when I was a even younger lawyer, just starting my career, I went to the managing partner of our firm and said, I want to get involved. Where should I do that? And the mentors and colleagues, particularly senior partners in your firm, know the organizations in your community, know those that could match with your interests or your desires. Some of the things Perry and I talked about, business development, making a difference, business experience, they can help kind of direct you not only to the organizations where it would be most valuable for you to be involved, but also who to talk to. Most of these things are relationship based. So on many boards, there'll be a membership or a nominating committee chair who will be in charge of finding new board members. And to have a warm introduction, like anything, is certainly more valuable than a cold call. Not that you can't get in without a relationship, for sure, but find those people that know the organizations that you can be most valuable in is really a useful way to get started.
yeah, I think that's great advice, Andy, for sure. So the next topic for discussion is what questions should you ask? And certainly this can be questions that you can ask of the colleague or mentor who told you about this organization and encouraged you to get involved, or it could be questions that you can ask about someone else that you know who serves on the board. When I joined the current nonprofit board that I sit on, I had a colleague and mentor who'd previously served on the board who encouraged me to get involved and set up an in-person meeting that I had with the executive director of the organization as well as the chairman of the board of the organization at that time. And we just had lunch and, they just told me, the executive director told me, her story and how the organization got started and what programs and activities the organization supports. And then the chairman of the board there was there to tell me, what the board composition looked like and what the expectations of the board were and all that kind of stuff. And it was great. Um, and ideally, a board that asks you to join will be very upfront with you and will provide that information without you asking. But we thought it'd be helpful to go through a couple of things to jot down when the time comes. And I think the first thing is this is a really important one is what is the financial commitment involved? It's not one that I had paid a lot of attention to before I joined. Um, since I've been more involved and had a little bit more experience, I've come to learn that it's basically an expectation of almost every nonprofit board that I know of, that I've talked with people who serve on the boards, that there's some kind of financial obligation, whether a hard obligation or a soft obligation to support the organization in a financial manner. And this is so important given, we're all young lawyers. We've all, in addition to our time constraints, we all have a lot of financial constraints. The ABA YLD is very focused on tackling the student debt issue. Most young lawyers are coming out with a lot in student debt, and you may not be in a position where you want to make a large financial contribution every year to a nonprofit organization. You may already, be an active member of a church or another organization that you actively give to, and your resources may be going elsewhere. So, again, I would not be afraid to ask this question. It's it can be one that can be a little bit uncomfortable to bring up. And people might be afraid to bring it up because you don't want to appear cheap or appear, like money is everything. And so I don't think that I brought it up when I first met with the executive director and chairman of the board. But I will tell you that every executive director and board member of one of these organizations is not going to be put off by that question. They will expect that question, probably. If they are, put off by that question, then that's probably a board you don't want to join anyway. So I would not be afraid to ask the question. In my experience on the board that I serve on, there is no sort of hard and fast rules about how much money you should contribute to the organization, but it's made very clear that it's an expectation that there's giving. And it's in our board meeting, it's updated pretty regularly on what the board contribution levels are, not specifically like Perry McLennan donated this much, but overall year to date, the board has contributed X amount of money, and the organization will set goals for board giving. So there can be some, a little bit of soft pressure there. I think when nonprofit executive directors and board members go to these conferences and stuff on nonprofits and healthy boards, board giving is a big thing that they discuss, and that may even be a way that some of these third party groups that rate the health of nonprofit organizations, that they look at board giving. So just keep that in mind, and certainly have that on your list of questions to ask.
Yeah, let me cover time commitment. I think that's an important one that everybody needs to think about before they join any nonprofit board. You ought to have a detailed conversation with existing board members and the executive director, whomever is leading your conversation about joining the board, about what that expectation is. Some things you can predict. Most boards will have regular meetings, monthly meetings, or quarterly meetings. based on whatever the bylaws of the organization provide. But some boards will require you to also join a committee or more than one committee and attend those committee meetings. Some boards have a tradition of going on a retreat or going to a conference together. So you'll want to understand the scope of the time commitment involved, not only for those formal meetings and retreats, but also tying into Perry's point about financial commitment. What are your expectations for joining fundraising events? Are you expected to invite folks, fill a table, for example, at an annual luncheon or a gala? How involved are you to be in setting those sorts of things up? My experience, there are really two types of boards. There's the type of board that's typically a smaller nonprofit organization where you're both the board member and the implementer. And then there's the other example of the board I mentioned I'm chairing this year, where there's hundreds of employees that do the good work of the organization, and the board operates more on a strategic level with management. You ought to understand what kind of board you're joining, and if it's the first type, where the board members are the implementers, then you need to be ready to do everything from setting up the event to taking it down to getting it organized and the contract signed. I mean, those are significant, weighty responsibilities. You just need to understand what the board culture is like before you get involved, and make sure that, as a young lawyer, that time commitment is something you can professionally commit to.
Yeah, I think there were a few excellent points Andy made in there. I would say that the board that I currently serve on is probably somewhere kind of in between the two examples that he gave. Sometimes I feel like we're both, big picture strategy advising, and I feel like we're responsible for a little bit of implementation too, because we're relatively small. Our staff is, maybe at any one time 10 to 20 deep. We have a fantastic executive director who does most of the implementation, but it is an active board. It is certainly a board where they expect board members to do much more than show up to the one board meeting, every month. You're expected to serve on committees within the board. You are expected to do some of the fundraising activities that Andy made reference to. We have fairly regular fundraising luncheons and things like that, where they will ask the board to fill a table. And one of the things I most hate in life is asking people for money. I just don't like doing it. I don't think I would be a great salesperson, and so that was something that I had to get used to. I did not really anticipate that when I joined a board. It was not one of the questions that I asked, but I think it, in addition to what is the financial commitment, I think Andy makes a great point. I think, what are the fundraising responsibilities? Am I going to have to fill that table, and all of that kind of stuff. So great point there. Some of these kind of bleed together, but Andy talked a little bit about board composition and board culture. Take a look at who's currently serving on the board. I mean, I think that can tell you a lot about the organization and its current health. I think most nonprofit websites have a list of their board members on there. Most of them, like mine, have the person's name and the company that the person works for. So even if you don't, get on, Google stalk the board members and see who they are, see what they do, see what they're about. One of the things that I looked at when I joined the board, this is one of the things I definitely did my first time around. I definitely studied pretty closely who was on the board. I looked at what companies were represented on the board, because I had just moved to Charleston at the time. I didn't know a lot of local people, so most of the names on the board did not sound familiar to me, but I looked up companies. Where does this person work? What organizations does this person work for? What position are they in? That can tell you a lot about the type and the caliber of person that's serving on the board. Um, that's important for a lot of reasons. Back to all the reasons that we discussed for joining the board, that if you've got other high quality individuals serving on the board, that will reduce your burden on the board a lot. If you can count on others, could be potentially good for business development, meeting people, things like that. So definitely take a look at who's serving on the board. Don't hesitate to reach out to board members. I mean, if somebody saw my name on the nonprofit's website and reached out to me, I mean, I would be more than happy to talk to someone about my experiences and talk about the organization, and be very upfront with them. And I think you'll find that most people won't mind that either. So um, take a look at who's serving on the board. That's an easy one.
Yeah. I think I'm going to expand a bit on this fourth point on this slide, but the core is you must do your due diligence before you join a board on that organization's organizational foundation and financial foundation. And what I mean by that is, do not hesitate to ask questions of current board members, and in particular the chair and the executive director of the organization, about their articles of incorporation. Review those. Review their bylaws. Look at the IRS 1023 application and the determination letter from the IRS that they are qualified as a nonprofit organization. Get the IRS 990 forms. If you all aren't familiar with that, that's the return of a tax-exempt organization that's filed every year. Those are publicly available online. There's a website I use called GuideStar that you can create a free account and search any nonprofit and find 990s. It gives you a real digest of the revenues and the expenses and what they pay their employees that are highly compensated, who's on the board. A lot of your questions can be answered by looking at those documents. Now, you also, if the organization is audited, you also want to ask for a copy of their most recent financial audit. Take a look at all those things, and it will give you a sense of how the organization is run. It'll give you a sense of what's going on beneath the list of board members and the time commitment and the financial commitment, beneath the mission. How is the business of the nonprofit run? And as lawyers, we previously talked about, folks are going to look to you for leadership. So you ought to know before you get into an organization, is it well run or not? What things would I ask questions about? Do I ask questions about before I join? Because once you're on the board, you have fiduciary responsibility to that organization. And you don't want to join a board that is not run well, a board where there are potential fiduciary liability issues. You want to join a board that is a good operating organization. So looking at those sorts of documents will help you have a better sense of whether that's in fact the case.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. You mentioned two things there that are very important, and we'll continue to expand on a little bit in the next section. But one is fiduciary duties that you as a board member will owe to the organization. I think everybody is familiar with the concept, even if you're not a corporate lawyer, familiar with the concept from law school. One of those being the duty of care and duty to be informed. And so, you don't want to join a nonprofit board and, there'd be some massive outstanding, judgment or something like that against the organization that you didn't know about. And now you're placed into a position that, you had no idea about. So I think that's really good. I'm also glad Andy mentioned it's GuideStar, right, Andy?
Right, GuideStar. I think it's guidestar.org. Great website.
Yeah, GuideStar is a great resource for doing this and for researching nonprofits. And I should have mentioned that when you're searching for information on nonprofits, they publish all types of financial info, and I think give ratings and awards and guides and stuff like that to nonprofits and give them marks based on how healthy their balance sheet is and things like that. So that's very important. One other thing, and this kind of starts to trickle into our next topic, which is professional responsibility rules, is the D&O, directors and officers insurance for board members. You may want to ask about that as well. That is, again, for those of you, most of you are probably familiar with directors and officers liability insurance, but it's something that you definitely want to make sure that the organization has in place to have you covered for decisions that business decisions that you make as a board member. Can we go to the next slide?
Sure, yeah.
Sorry. All right. So professional responsibility pitfalls. I think and I see we have at least one question about that. I think this is a really important thing to keep in mind before you join, and sort of it's important as just a reminder, even for myself and for Andy and anybody else, maybe you're already on one. It's important to keep in mind your entire tenure as a member of the board. We as lawyers are in sort of a unique position with respect to serving on nonprofit boards. Most nonprofit organizations that I know of, I mean, they want lawyers on boards. So, you're in a good position to start with respect to finding one, because organizations love to have lawyers on board. So I don't think you're going to have a hard time finding one to join. And the reason for that, I think Andy made reference to this earlier, is because of our, experience and education dealing with, all types of organizational legal issues that, many people in the organization don't know, and where a lot of private businesses would have to go out and hire a lawyer to advise them on certain things. Unfortunately, a lot of nonprofit organizations see the opportunity to get sort of, free legal advice by way of, inviting lawyers to join the board, which is, dangerous, and you need to be very careful of. Nonprofit organizations are, many, or especially the smaller ones, try to keep costs down, and, they may be doing it for the best of reasons, but it presents some unique challenges to young lawyers because of our duties of professional responsibility. I think from a very big picture takeaway standpoint on professional responsibility is to be mindful of two separate roles. Your role as a board member, as being completely separate from your law practice, and not intermingling the two. What do I mean by that? I mean that when you serve on a board, you are a board member, and the input that you provide to the board is in your capacity as a member of the board, just like everyone else on the board. You are not providing legal advice to the board. The board is not your client. I mean, the organization is not your client. And to the extent that you're providing legal advice, it can create all kinds of problems. Just one quick example of that is with respect to insurance. your malpractice insurance that you have or that your firm has for you it is probably not going to cover, your if to the extent you provide any legal advice to the board without, it being an actual client of your firm, you're probably not going to be covered on malpractice insurance if any of that has, if that happens. And you may, by providing legal advice to the board, be taken outside of the directors and officers liability insurance. So you've got to be very careful. I think it's helpful to make sure other board members, know and understand that at certain times. Some of the best ways that I know how to deal with it are, if 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 the organization turns to you and says, hey Perry or hey Andy, we need to refresh our bylaws. Why don't you're a lawyer, why don't you do it for us? I think you need to make clear that, look, we need to have a full committee doing this, not just me. You don't want to take complete ownership for something like that. I think it's always good to have input from others. It's good to make clear in writing, if you can, that you're reviewing as a board member and not a lawyer, and making clear that the organization should consider hiring outside counsel to do something like that, particularly if it's something outside of your wheelhouse, like filing an application for tax exempt status or something along those lines. So those are my sort of quick thoughts on professional responsibility pitfalls. Andy, do you have any?
I think you pretty well covered it, Perry. It's certainly an area fraught with risk. I'm inclined when I'm serving on a nonprofit board to not engage as a lawyer. There's certainly a lot of conflict issues involved when you're putting on both of those hats. Different size boards require different needs, and each situation is different. So you all have to talk closely with the ethics counsel at your firm or the state bar about those sorts of concerns if you do have them. But you definitely have to be aware of that potential blurring of the line.
Yeah, and I see that we have a question from one of our attendees asking if you have provided legal services for the organizations while serving on the board, and if so, did you use a written engagement agreement, whether or not you charged for those services? So there is nothing, if done correctly, that there is nothing prohibiting an attorney from both serving on the board of directors or board of trustees of an organization, and also being a outside counsel lawyer for that organization. As Andy references, probably not something I would generally advise, just because of how fraught it is with professional responsibility issues, but it can work. And certainly you need a written engagement letter, written agreement, clearly outlining what your role is as lawyer and as board member, and being as narrow and specific as possible as to what legal advice you're providing, so as to not create any questions around that. And ideally you'd want board minutes and all of that reflecting the fact that the board voted to retain you as outside counsel. If you work for a firm, I get an insurance questionnaire every year about what organizations I serve on the board of. You certainly want to inform those within your firm, and advise them and have them help you figure out the potential conflicts issues, potentially notifying insurance carriers that you're going to be taking on this dual role, all of that kind of stuff. So it can be done, but it's a little bit tricky. I hope that answers your question, and I know we've got about 10 minutes left, and we've got a few additional questions that were submitted to us One of which kind of folds into that, and is it required to notify your employer about your involvement with a nonprofit board? That's going to depend. That's going to depend on your employment agreement with your organization, with your firm. But I would say most cases, yes. Most employment agreements I draft have a provision in there that requires employees notify their employer if they take on any significant activities outside of the practice of law for the firm. Some of them may carve out nonprofit service, but I think even if not required under a contract, you certainly owe a duty of loyalty to your firm, and I think it's a good idea to give them that heads up and to make sure they're okay with it, and to make sure that it's not causing any conflict issues and all of that kind of stuff. Yes, I think it's a great idea to notify your employer. A couple of other questions we had: what kind of role can young lawyers play on nonprofit boards? I think we've hopefully addressed that throughout this presentation. Same with, we had a question about what are a few key takeaways or learning opportunities that you can provide on nonprofit service, and I think we've tried to address that as well. Another question we had is, how can you leverage your involvement as a member of the board for your career and beyond? Andy, do you have any particular thoughts on that, or any of these other questions or issues I've been talking about?
Yeah. I think we spoke a bit about that. It's a good question, how to leverage your involvement on a board for your career. I think the primary thing I would point to is what I discussed on business development opportunities and connections with the board members that you're serving with on your board. It's a great opportunity, not as a lawyer, as a peer, make those connections and go out of your way to be intentional about getting to know your fellow board members better. There's this dynamic where everybody's a busy professional on the board, and certainly we fall into that category, and you shuffle in for your board meeting and you shuffle out. Maybe it's at the end of the day and everybody's running home to dinner. Maybe it's a breakfast meeting and you leave that and you're heading off to work or lunch. It's challenging to actually create meaningful relationships with your fellow board members unless you go out and build it. And so what I would recommend for young lawyers, it's like the informational interviewing that they taught us in law school when you're looking for that first job. Just create a list of the board members you don't know well and say, can I take you to lunch? Or can we go out for a drink after this board meeting? I want to pick your brain about this finance policy, or how you've addressed that issue with fellow board members before. How do you fundraise for your table for our luncheon? Use that platform to leverage your involvement to develop your career, either through creating new client relationships or through creating opportunities outside of your practice through those relationships. I think it's a great venue to do that.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. Thanks, Andy. We had another question that says, I am on an advisory board. Should I have an agreement in place with them to vet legal docs? Certainly. I think that goes back to our conversation that if you're, that is, engaging in the practice of law, and certainly I think, with any client, you want a written agreement as to what the scope of your services are. And I think it's even more important when you're sort of serving in this dual role as, both legal advisor and board member, which we would very much caution you about. Okay, what else do we have? We have a question that, do many boards offer internships? And I am not sure if this question is in regards to sort of an internship for, quasi board service, so that if you're considering joining a board, is there sort of a board light position, that you could, shadow or that type of thing to figure out whether the organization is right for you and that type of thing. Board I serve on doesn't have anything formal like that, but certainly, nonprofit organizations are always looking for volunteers. And I know that the board I serve on, really the pathway to getting on the board is doing volunteer work. And oftentimes, if you volunteer with the organization and you ask if you could, potentially join a board meeting, or a portion of a board meeting, typically the board is okay with that. So that's what I would advise if you're trying to go that route. Any thoughts from
Yeah,
you,
I
Andy?
agree with that. No, I think that's great. But there's also something I'm seeing more and more of, at least in North Carolina, and that is organizations who will start to create what they call a young professionals board. That is not the full governing body of the organization, but it's a group of folks, young professionals from all disciplines and industries, who they want to get involved in a fundraising capacity. And many of these organizations will treat young professional boards like a feeder for their main board service. So I would certainly be encouraging to any of you who are interested in board service but not quite sure you want to take that full jump. Find a young professionals board. Typically, they do all the fun stuff. They organize a lot of the fun events and gather at functions, just to increase the name recognition. Find one of those to do and learn more about the organization before you jump into the full board.
Yeah, I think that's a great thought. I know our local chamber of commerce, for instance, has that. They have a big board, so to speak, and then they have a young professionals board. Some of the bar associations and things like that have those as well, as well as like I know the United Way, in our area has that. They have a dedicated young professionals board, which is a great way to get involved, before you potentially join the big board. And a lot of organizations probably have that. So that's great advice. So it's 1:58 Eastern time here. We're coming up on the hour mark, which was our allotted time. So I thank everybody for joining today. I hope it was somewhat helpful to most of you. If you have questions for either Andy or I, feel free to reach out to us. I think we're pretty easy to find. If you Google us and go to our firm page on our firm website, I think you can find our email very easily. I'm happy to talk with anybody about my experience or questions that you may not have had the chance to answer today. But on behalf of Andy and I and the American Bar Association Young Lawyers Division, thank you again for joining today, and I hope you have a great rest of the week and weekend.